thing you found has made you very, very ill. You found it, didn't you? Where is it? Where's the mammoth?
Photographer Henry Tyson travels to the surroundings of the northern town of Fortitude. While taking landscape photos, he suddenly hears screams from the shore and sees a bear devouring a man alive. The man fires a shot, but instead of hitting the bear, he accidentally shoots the man. The sheriff, who arrives immediately, tells him to go home, promising to handle everything himself. Frightened, the elderly man runs off without approaching the body. 3 months later, Liam Sutter and Carrie Morgan discover a mummified mammoth during a glacier walk. Carrie pulls a tooth from its mouth, and the children return home. However, Liam faints on the doorstep of his house. When Liam's father, helicopter rescue pilot Frank Sutter, returns home, his wife Jules informs him that Liam has a high fever and won't wake up. On the same day, scientist Vincent Rattray arrives in Fortitude. Professor Stoddard greets him and invites him to dinner on Friday evening, where his assistant Natalie will also be present. The professor plans to discuss Vincent's report on the impact of tourism on the environment. Meanwhile, Carrie tells her father, Ronnie Morgan, about Liam's illness, shows him the tooth, and describes their discovery. A doctor visits Liam, learns that his father served in Afghanistan, and diagnoses the boy with mumps. The doctor advises that someone should always stay with Liam. Meanwhile, Ronnie Morgan and his friend Jason decide to sell the mammoth to a research center. At the same time, the doctor informs Governor Hildur and the local sheriff about Liam's condition. There is a possibility that Liam has contracted polio brought back from Afghanistan by his father, which might require isolating the town. Morgan and Jason transport the mammoth to a warehouse. That evening, Frank begins an affair with Elena, a waitress at a local bar. Meanwhile, Jason tries to sell the mammoth tooth to the professor, but the professor refuses to pay. Jason takes the tooth and leaves. Later, the sheriff and Frank patrol the area by helicopter and encounter 2 travelers, Yuri Lubimov and Max Cordero. The men claim they don't need hunting rifles since they are heading inland, where polar bears are less common. The sheriff shows them photos of the mauled man, hands them his rifle, and orders them to return to town for proper equipment. Upon returning to town, the sheriff visits Henry, who is deeply shaken by the incident. The elderly man knows that the sheriff hid the bullet that killed geologist Pettigrew. Moreover, Henry didn't hear the sound of an engine at the scene, suggesting the sheriff was already there when everything happened. The sheriff demands that Henry forget the matter and leaves. Meanwhile, the professor refuses to provide Hildur with a positive report for constructing an ice hotel, as he has made a groundbreaking discovery that could shock the world. That evening, Jules and Frank argue, and Jules leaves the house, reminding her husband of the need to watch Liam. While Jules is at the bar, Elena visits Frank. He leaves Liam alone and takes Elena to the shed. As they indulge in their affair, Liam wakes up, opens the window, and walks barefoot into the snow. Later, Frank returns home, covered in blood. He washes up and disposes of his shirt just as Jules enters. She notices that Liam has awakened and is hungry, much to the parents' relief. However, Liam begins to scream later. Pulling back the blanket, his parents see that his legs have turned black. Liam is rushed to the hospital. The doctor is puzzled by severe frostbite, which may require amputation. Jules realizes Frank left the house and blames him, prompting Frank to flee. That evening, Vincent finds the professor in his home with a sliced abdomen. As Vincent checks for a pulse, Stoddard's dog attacks him, but the sheriff, already present in the room, kills the dog. The sheriff escorts Vincent out and calls the station. That evening, Hildur delivers a speech praising Fortitude as a safe and peaceful town, while armed police officers, with sirens and flashing lights, respond to a major incident visible to all the townspeople. The sheriff informs the governor of the incident and declares an alert due to bear attacks. Meanwhile, Henry burns a letter ordering him to leave Fortitude due to a terminal illness. He breaks down crying in the street. The doctor tells Jules about Fortitude's research center, where they may help Liam. During the night, an alarm warns of bear attacks. Armed townspeople patrol the streets, while Hildur and the doctor visit the professor's home. The sheriff points out the wounds and insists a bear wasn't responsible. Suddenly, the doctor notices a faint heartbeat in the professor. The injured man is taken to an ambulance. News spreads of the attack, not by a bear. Henry calls mainland police from the bar, claiming Pettigrew wasn't killed by a bear but by the sheriff, who he believes also attacked the professor. Meanwhile, Vincent recalls that the professor's assistant, Natalie, was also invited to dinner. The sheriff orders her to be found and brought to the station. Hildur informs the sheriff that the professor has died. Later, during an interrogation, Vincent assures the sheriff that he checked the professor's condition and that the man was definitely dead. Concurrently, the doctor begins treating Liam, sedating him. Police officer Ingrid sneaks into Natalie's home and discovers she has taken some clothes and fled on her snowmobile. As search parties prepare to find Natalie, the sheriff warns Hildur that if she seeks help from the mainland, she may be accused of orchestrating the professor's murder to gain approval for the Glacier Hotel construction, which the professor strongly opposed. At this time, Yuri returns to town looking for the sheriff to return the rifle. Entering the sheriff's office, he retrieves his own handgun and a pair of handcuffs. Meanwhile, Senior Inspector Eugene Morton from the London Police flies into Fortitude to investigate the mysterious death of a British citizen. On the flight, his seatmate is Professor Standart's wife, Patricia, who is still unaware of the tragedy. At the police station, the sheriff and Hildur realize that Vincent is innocent, but decide to keep him in custody until they find the real perpetrator. Jules, meanwhile, suspects that Frank was with another woman instead of watching over their son and throws him out of the house. Hildur reluctantly introduces Morton to the sheriff, who represents the interests of the Stoddart family. Noticing the sheriff's open hostility, Morton asks to be taken to the station. There, he meets Patricia and informs her of her husband's death, observing her reaction to confirm her innocence. Elena invites Frank to stay in her room for the time being. As Morton begins his investigation, he takes charge of the professor's autopsy and notices evidence of 3 different weapons used in the attack, suggesting a possible ritualistic killing. However, the sheriff interrupts, presenting a potato peeler found at the scene, and orders Morton to leave his town. Natalie, spending time with Jason, discovers the mammoth tooth in his cabin. Meanwhile, Ronnie, seeing a police car drive by, tries to call his partner, suspecting that he might be responsible for the professor's death. Morton meets 2 townsfolk, Marcus, a chemistry and biology teacher, and his girlfriend, Shirley. They explain that burials are not allowed in Fortitude because bodies in the permafrost do not decompose and may harbor dangerous bacteria. Instead, the terminally ill are sent to the mainland. At the warehouse, faint cracking noises are heard coming from the Mammoth. Police arrive at Jason's home, but his wife claims not to know his whereabouts, and her potato peeler is accounted for. Morton meets Elena, who shares that she came from Spain and barely knew the man who was mauled by the bear. Later, Morton receives the keys to the professor's office from Patricia and permission to search it. However, the sheriff and Vincent arrive first. The professor's assistant finds a photo of a deer carcass taken by Natalie that morning, complete with geotag information. Realizing its location, the sheriff deduces where Natalie and Jason are hiding. As they leave, they encounter Morton, who gives Vincent his phone number, suspecting the sheriff's actions are unlawful. That evening, Ronnie takes his daughter and leaves town. In a bar, Morton learns that Henry made a call from the Pettyphone on the night of the murder. Shortly after, Morton is contacted by Vincent, who reveals that the sheriff was already in the house when he discovered the professor. Hildur visits Patricia and listens to the professor's last message to his wife, in which he mentions finding something ancient in the ice that could cause significant problems. Hildur deletes the message. Meanwhile, police arrive at the cabin where Natalie and Jason are hiding. While inspecting the professor's home, Morton and Deputy Petra conclude that the professor willingly let his killer inside. Police arrest Natalie and Jason. In parallel, Hildur visits Henry, who admits that he saw the professor shortly before his death. The professor had told him that he would not allow the construction of the Glacier Hotel because he had discovered something incredibly valuable there. Patricia informs Morton that Hildur deleted her husband's message about the mysterious find. She also reveals that the professor had planned to rewrite his report on the environmental impact of the ice hotel construction. Morton heads to the police station and blackmails one of the on-duty officers into granting him access to the station's surveillance footage. Through this, he discovers the illegal detention of Jason, who has an alibi for the time of the murder. However, Jason is still forced to explain the reason behind his argument with the professor. The sheriff returns Natalie's mammoth tooth and instructs her to run tests on it. That evening, Henry visits Liam. Jules mentions that Liam enjoys Henry's book and would be happy to meet him. Meanwhile, Vincent is released from custody. The next morning, Detective Morton visits the professor's house, startling Yuri. While searching the house, Morton discovers geologist Pettigrew's report. The sheriff receives a message about gunfire nearby. He heads to a taxidermy shop and finds a drunken Henry who pleads with the sheriff to shoot him and end his troubles with deportation. The sheriff confiscates Henry's gun and helps him back home. There, Henry confesses that he drinks because he killed Pettigrew. However, the sheriff unexpectedly admits that the death was his fault. Morton contacts a colleague in London who doesn't understand the significance of Pettigrew's map. Meanwhile, police arrive at Jason's brother Kieran's house and find him beaten and tied up. It turns out that Ronnie attacked him, trying to buy a boat. When Kieran tried to make him leave, Ronnie beat him up. The police search Ronnie's house and realize he has fled with his daughter, making him a potential suspect in the murder. A search is launched, and soon, GPS coordinates of his boat are obtained. The sheriff and Frank set out to track him down. At the same time, Yuri informs Cordero that Morton has found the photo they need at the professor's house. Detective Morton visits Henry and questions him about Pettigrew's behavior, why he ventured into a dangerous area, and about the connection between the two deaths. Morton also brings up Henry's call to the mainland police from the bar. Henry claims ignorance. Patricia leaves Hildor's house and moves into a hotel. Morton tells Hildor that Patricia suspects her of killing her husband over the construction report. Yuri sneaks into Morton's hotel room and steals Pettigrew's photographs. Meanwhile, Jules visits Hildor's husband, Eric, a police officer. While washing up, Eric drops a soap dish and discovers a blood-stained shirt belonging to Frank in the trash. At the same time, the sheriff and Frank locate Ronnie's boat, but neither he nor his daughter are aboard. Ronnie has hidden Carrie in a small cabin on the shore while he tries to gather money for tickets. Natalie explains to Jason that the mammoth tooth is 32,000 years old and asks him to turn over the mammoth remains to the research center. Jason, however, claims that the tooth belonged to a family member who received it during his naval service. Patricia confronts Hildor, demanding the return of the professor's report and accusing her of deleting the message. Jason inspects the mammoth. After he leaves, Ronnie sneaks in and saws off the tusks. Returning to the cabin, he tells Carrie that the tusks are worth a fortune. He admits that the police suspect him of murder and that he'll do whatever it takes to keep them together. That evening, the sheriff learns that the blood on Frank's shirt is human and informs Hildor that the professor was killed by the rescue worker. The sheriff storms into the hotel, barges into Elena's room, and finds Frank in the shower. Ignoring Elena's screams, he begins beating Frank as Perta and Morton observe the scene. That night, Ronnie and Carrie camp out in a tent. Ronnie tells his daughter that the noise they hear beneath them is the movement of the glacier, a force that cannot be stopped. Shirley, who had recently visited the warehouse, begins to feel ill and develops a severe cough. Meanwhile, the sheriff confesses to Henry that he attacked Frank out of jealousy over Elena. The doctor treats Frank's wounds while Morton informs Hildor of the need to suspend the sheriff. There is an urgent requirement to run a DNA analysis on Frank's shirt. The sheriff suggests using the lab at the research center. While Natalie works in the lab, Petra notices jars containing deformed reindeer embryos. Natalie explains that cases of hermaphroditic births have increased and they are trying to determine the cause. In the interrogation room, Morton and Hildor question Frank, who claims he spent the evening at home. He insists the blood on his shirt belongs to Liam and came from a burst tumor in the boy's throat. However, Morton uncovers that Frank was discharged from the military due to health issues and orders a blood test for verification. Next, Jules is questioned. She explains Liam's frostbite, which surprises the detective. The truth about Frank's absence from home emerges. Frank reluctantly admits he was with Elena at the time. Elena is called in for questioning. She answers their questions but denies any involvement in the professor's murder. Morton requests her file and discovers that she and her former lover were convicted of murder in Spain. Elena insists she has changed and denies killing the professor with Frank. Morton then brings up Pettigrew, noting Elena's strange reaction to his name. The sheriff realizes that Morton's primary reason for being in Fortitude is to investigate Pettigrew's death. The DNA analysis results come back. The blood on Frank's shirt matches the professor's. Frank explains that he washed the blood off Liam and insists he did not kill the professor. Police search Frank's home and Liam's room, finding the boy's blood-stained pajamas from the night of the murder. The sheriff hands the pajamas to Hildor and Morton, insisting that Frank's story checks out. This means Liam was present when the professor was killed. Frank recalls that Liam's bedroom window was open that night. The story flashes back to the night of the professor's murder. Stoddart sees Liam outside and brings the child into his house, ignoring his growling dog. While trying to warm Liam, the boy hits him on the head with a cutting board. Later, Frank returns home from his rendezvous and finds his bloodied son on the floor. He carries Liam to the bathroom and washes him, searching for any injuries. Finding none, he is relieved that his son seems to have recovered. Liam then falls asleep. In the present, Morton, the sheriff, and Petra re-examine the professor's body and discover a child's fingernail embedded in one of his ribs. They head to the research center to see if they can wake Liam. The doctor warns that waking him will cause unbearable pain in his frostbitten legs. Jules reluctantly agrees after the sheriff's urging. When Liam wakes, he recalls the food the professor was cooking and his dog, but then he begins screaming in pain, shouting that he put his hands inside a person. The doctor sedates him again. Meanwhile, Eric reveals the truth about the professor's death to Patricia. She refuses to believe it, even as the entire town buzzes with news about Liam. The sheriff informs Frank that irrefutable evidence has been found linking Liam to the murder, but Frank refuses to accept it. Despite this, he is released from custody. Detective Morton discusses Liam with his London colleague, questioning what could drive a child to commit such an act. The conversation shifts back to Pettigrew. Morton notices the word Max on Pettigrew's folder and speculates it might be a name. Meanwhile, Shirley's condition worsens and she begins to experience fever and chills. Her symptoms mirror those described in the professor's mysterious report. Detective Morton confronts Max Cordero at the research center and demands to know who stole Pettigrew's photographs. Max reluctantly admits that Yuri took them. Meanwhile, Henry approaches taxidermist Tavrani, asking him to craft a protective amulet, a tupalak, for Liam. At first, Tavrani laughs it off, noting that for the tupalak to work, it must be baptized with the blood of a killer. Henry volunteers his own blood. Jason visits the warehouse and discovers that Morgan has stolen the tusks. To his horror, the mammoth continues to slowly thaw. Morton presents the sheriff with a recorded call in which Henry explicitly states that he killed Pettigrew. Henry explains that he responded to a report of a missing person and found a polar bear mauling Pettigrew alive. He claims it was a mercy killing. Morton, however, is skeptical. Returning to his hotel room, Morton notices that the carpets and floorboards have been replaced. Spotting Elena nearby, he accuses her of hiding evidence of Pettigrew's blood. Flashback: during a Christmas party, Pettigrew shows Yuri the photographs he took and claims they are worth a fortune. Eric asks them to leave, but Pettigrew starts a fight. Drunken Yuri tries to intervene but slips and loses consciousness. When he wakes up, both men are gone, blood stains the snow, and the scanned photograph is crumpled in his hands. Present: a drill ship arrives in Fortitude, and Hildur celebrates the resolution of the professor's murder, eager to move forward with the ICE hotel project. Elena informs the sheriff that Morton has noticed the replaced carpet and floorboards. The sheriff reassures her that the detective has no solid evidence. At the same time, Tavrani draws Henry's blood for the tupalak. He warns that if the evil Liam is battling proves too strong, the tupalak could harm its creator. Meanwhile, Marcus returns home to find Shirley complaining of a sore throat. On the glacier, Ronnie tells Carrie they need to meet a boat, but he begins coughing violently and retreats to the bathroom. Seizing the opportunity, Carrie calls the police and says she wants to come home. Ronnie snatches the phone from her and, despite pleas to return, now that everyone knows he didn't kill the professor, refuses to take the risk. Henry develops a photograph taken on the shore, revealing that Pettigrew was handcuffed to a tower when the bear mauled him. Morton tracks down Yuri, who admits to knowing Pettigrew's killer. At the bar, the sheriff confronts Henry about his call to the mainland. Henry breaks down in tears. Yuri tells Morton that Pettigrew died following a fight with Eric and hands over a bullet from a hunting rifle that he found at the geologist's death site. Yuri accuses the police of covering for Eric but admits he doesn't know what Pettigrew discovered. At the dock, the man Morgan hired to smuggle him and Carrie out turns on them, stealing the tusks at gunpoint and leaving the pair stranded. Carrie insists they return to Fortitude. That evening, the sheriff assures Elena that he didn't kill Pettigrew. She warns him that Morton won't leave until he uncovers the truth. Meanwhile, Morton sneaks into the storage room where police rifles are kept. Night. Shirley gets out of bed and attacks her mother, slicing open her abdomen and spitting a clear fluid into the wound. She then smears blood across the walls before walking barefoot into the snow. The governor is in a call with mainland investors when the sheriff informs her of an attack on the doctor and Shirley's disappearance. At the crime scene, Ingrid discovers that the doctor is still alive. On the glacier, Carrie persuades her father to return to Fortitude. Before they can leave, Ronnie collapses, unconscious. At the hotel, Morton tells Henry that Yuri believes the police are covering up Pettigrew's murder. He expresses frustration at the constant interference in his investigation. Just then, Ingrid reports another attack. Morton goes to the station and reminds everyone that Marcus is Liam's teacher, suggesting he might have transmitted something to the boy. Later, the sheriff and Morton interrogate Marcus about his whereabouts the previous night. Marcus claims he went home after the bar, fed his dog, and went to bed. He insists he had a good relationship with Shirley's mother, the doctor, but Morton and the sheriff remain skeptical. Meanwhile, Ingrid and Petra find Shirley lying on the floor of a store with a terrified Carrie nearby. At the same time, Ronnie regains consciousness and sets off to find his daughter. The police head to the glacier, tracking him. Marcus is taken into custody, giving Frank hope that his son might be innocent. However, Jules insists that Frank is just trying to soothe his guilt for leaving Liam alone. The sheriff visits Carrie at Elena's hotel and asks Elena to look after the girl until Ronnie is found. As they part, Elena tells the sheriff that something terrible is happening in Fortitude and that Shirley was a victim of it. On the mainland, Hilda realizes that her superiors have no intention of helping Fortitude. In Fortitude, Frank sneaks into Marcus's house. Meanwhile, Carrie asks Elena to take her home and invites her to stay there until Ronnie returns. Frank brings a stack of photographs to the police station, which he found in Marcus's house. Most of them show Shirley eating. When the sheriff learns that Frank broke into the house, he orders him to join the search for Ronnie, despite Frank's insistence that Marcus is guilty. The sheriff and Morton show Marcus several photos of him as a child holding animal entrails. Marcus explains that they were taken during hunting trips. When Morton sees photographs of Marcus's mother, who was an extremely obese woman, he begins to understand Marcus's obsession with feeding Shirley. He then informs Marcus of Shirley's death, leaving the teacher visibly shaken. Meanwhile, Tavrani continues working on the Tupilak, while Henry reassures him that belief is the key to its power. Morton admits to the sheriff that they have no concrete evidence against Marcus and doubts he is involved. Meanwhile, Ronnie returns to his house, where a projector is playing a video of his wife. He hears someone enter the room behind him and, thinking it is Carrie, begins talking about her mother. Turning around, he is struck on the head. Fortitude's residents gather for a meeting. Frank sees Marcus walking by and becomes agitated. The sheriff tries to calm the crowd, insisting that Shirley died a natural death, but they refuse to listen. They accuse the governor of prioritizing the ICE hotel construction over their safety. As tensions escalate, Hildur enters and announces that she visited the doctor, who is still alive. However, she adds that no help will come from the mainland. Meanwhile, Elena and Carrie arrive at the Morgans' house and are surprised to find the projector running. Suddenly, the power goes out. They are forced to use a flashlight to check the circuit breakers. After the meeting, people disperse. Morton confesses to the sheriff that he still suspects him of killing Pettigrew. The sheriff leaves as Morton examines the bullet that killed the geologist. On his way home, the sheriff stops by to check on Carrie and Elena. The girl is already asleep. As the sheriff and Elena talk, they suddenly hear Carrie scream. She insists that she just saw her father standing in front of her. Elena calms her down, suggesting it was just a dream. Meanwhile, a man wearing a motorcycle helmet and wielding a bat breaks into Marcus's house and attacks him. When Marcus regains consciousness, he finds himself tied up with Frank standing over him. Frank declares that he is going to teach him a lesson. At the research center, the medic informs Jules that Liam will be awakened today. The sheriff tells Hildur that there is a connection between the attacks on the professor and the doctor. Meanwhile, Morton weighs the bullet found at Pettigrew's death site. Vincent and Natalie study the fetus of a hermaphroditic reindeer, which, according to the beliefs of Sami reindeer herders, is caused by a demon. At that moment, Ingrid brings Vincent a letter from the professor sent on the day of his death. It turns out to be an authorization to study the polar bear. Liam opens his eyes and the medic, examining his legs, celebrates, calling it a true miracle. Morton visits Karen's shop to inquire about who might have purchased the specific hunting rifle ammunition used in Pettigrew's death. However, Karen distrusts the police and refuses to cooperate. Hildur and the sheriff inform the Sutter family that Liam will not face charges, but their family must undergo testing to determine what caused the boy's actions. As they return home, they find a red inscription on Liam's wall reading, "Monster." Meanwhile, Vincent and Natalie retrieve a sample, a polar bear that killed and consumed another bear, and extract its brain for analysis. Henry delivers the Tupilak to Liam and advises Jules to leave Fortitude, warning that the town is no longer safe. Vincent and Natalie report to Hildur and the sheriff, theorizing that the bear's behavior was caused by toxin accumulation. They request permission to study Shirley's brain to determine if her aggression was caused by the same toxins. If so, it would confirm that Fortitude is an unsafe place to live. Frank returns to Marcus's house and demands to know how he framed Liam for the professor's murder. Marcus insists on his innocence, but Frank refuses to believe him, gags him again, and leaves. At the station, Morton examines the evidence collected from Pettigrew's death site. The sheriff enters, and Morton asks what caliber rifle the sheriff used to shoot Pettigrew. Meanwhile, Henry tells the sheriff that he intends to end his life on his own terms. Displeased with what Fortitude has become, and suspecting that the sheriff is part of the problem, Henry bids him farewell. The two men share a brief embrace before Henry leaves. At home, Frank sees Liam holding the Tupilak. He snatches it away and breaks it, causing Liam to cry. Jules pleads with Frank to leave. Morton visits Tavrani's shop to ask about a receipt found in Pettigrew's pocket. Tavrani shows him an Arctic hare that the geologist brought for taxidermy. Morton notices remnants of a Tupilak and asks if Henry donated blood for it. Realizing Henry might be gone for good, Morton searches for him but finds only his medication. Morton goes to Henry's apartment to examine his darkroom. On the glacier, Henry sets up camp and retrieves his camera. Morton, reviewing Henry's photographs, finds a picture of Pettigrew's hand. Meanwhile, Henry prepares a gun. Vincent and Natalie discover that the same toxins were present in Shirley and the polar bear. They request a lumbar puncture for Liam to determine if he was also affected. At Marcus's house, Frank pulls out pliers and demands that Marcus confess what he did to Liam. When Marcus continues to deny any wrongdoing, Frank pulls off one of his fingernails, accusing him of doing the same to Liam to frame him. Meanwhile, Jules repairs the tupalac and hears Marcus's screams. As Frank prepares to drill into Marcus's hand, Jules intervenes. She tells Frank that hurting Marcus won't help Liam. She unties Marcus and convinces her husband to come home, leaving Marcus sobbing on the floor. The sheriff visits the Morgans' house, showing Elena a glove that belonged to Ronnie. He says they've lost hope of finding him alive. Neither of them knows that Ronnie is nearby, hiding in a closet, eviscerated but still alive. On the glacier, Henry listens to music while the detective's colleague in London tries to contact Morton, who is still searching for Henry. Marcus wraps his injured hand when Jules visits him. He informs her that he won't let her husband's actions go unpunished. Meanwhile, Morton's car gets stuck in the snow. Morton's London colleague leaves him a voicemail, revealing that Pettigrew discovered a massive Mammoth graveyard. At the same time, the Sutter family sees police cars approaching their home and quickly get into their own car. However, the police merely invite them to sign a consent form for Liam's testing. If toxins are still affecting him, it could absolve him of guilt. Marcus visits the research center to say goodbye to Shirley, his only family apart from her comatose mother. He kisses Shirley on the lips before leaving. Elena shows Carrie her father's glove, which was found by the police on the glacier, and tells her that he is most likely dead. Carrie refuses to believe it, pushes Elena, and storms off to her room, unaware that her father lies barely alive nearby. Elena starts bleeding shortly after. Meanwhile, Natalie and Vincent collect cerebrospinal fluid from Liam. The tests, however, show no trace of the toxins found in Shirley and the polar bear. At Jason's house, he sits in a bathtub, numbly washing blood off himself. His wife, Celia, sees him and, panicking, demands to know what happened, but he doesn't answer. Natalie and Vincent go to the bar, where Natalie hypothesizes that the illness may have been transmitted by the doctor who treated both Liam and Shirley. She asks Vincent to help her test blood samples. Celia, frustrated by Jason's silence, calls his brother Kieran. Meanwhile, Elena sits outside Carrie's bedroom, sharing how the hardest part of prison was reliving the murder she committed and thinking about all she had lost. Carrie eventually comes out and hands Elena a bag of frozen peas, saying her mom used to do the same for her dad when he had bruises. Meanwhile, Ronnie, barely alive, is gasping for breath. Natalie and Vincent take blood samples from Hildur and the sheriff, suspecting that an unknown infection might be the cause of the illness. They acknowledge that they have no way of knowing how far it has spread. Hildur suggests isolating Fortitude and announcing a rabies outbreak to avoid panic while testing everyone. Kieran arrives at Jason's house but finds the room empty. Hildur informs Jules that Liam's test showed no toxins, devastating her. This means Liam acted up his own volition in killing the professor. At the same time, Liam looks out the window and sees Jason standing outside, staring back at him. Morton finally reaches the glacier and finds Henry. He tells Henry that he knows who shot Pettigrew and that the sheriff handcuffed him. Now he just needs to understand why such brutality occurred. Henry shoots Morton in the stomach. Seeing Morton struggle, Henry offers him powerful painkillers, but Morton refuses. Back at the Sutter home, Jules returns and tells Frank about the test results. Frank insists that all he ever wanted was to protect his family, which he has done his entire life. Meanwhile, Marcus retrieves Shirley's body. On the glacier, Morton declares that he will survive the wound, but Henry advises him not to get his hopes up and eventually gives him a painkiller. Enraged, Morton shouts that he came to Fortitude seeking justice, but there is none to be found. Back home, Jules tells Frank she'll prepare a family dinner and asks him to go to the store. Once he leaves, she frantically packs their belongings and takes Liam to the airport. However, the airport is closed due to the declared rabies outbreak. Jules forces her way past the police at the airport, and Ingrid threatens to shoot. Desperate, Jules throws herself at the gun, demanding that Ingrid pull the trigger. But Liam suddenly starts screaming, snapping Jules out of her frenzy. Ingrid orders everyone to return home. Meanwhile, Morton crawls toward Henry's snowmobile, only to discover that it is out of fuel. He notices Henry's radio and pleads for him to call for help. Henry begins reminiscing about his love for Niels Anderson's wife. Morton realizes that the sheriff is Henry's son and urges him to tell him the truth. Henry contacts the sheriff over the radio, confessing that he shot Detective Morton because he was getting too close to the truth. He then tosses the radio into the snow. At the station, Eric finds the sheriff sitting dejectedly in his office. The sheriff insists he's fine but tells Eric that he would make a good sheriff someday. That evening, Marcus prepares a funeral raft for Shirley and sets it ablaze on the water. Frank returns home to discover that his family is gone. The sheriff puts on his coat and leaves his office. On the glacier, Henry shoots himself in the head, collapsing lifelessly. Sometime later, a helicopter lands on the glacier, and the sheriff emerges. Discovering Henry's body, he rushes to Morton, who, with his last strength, demands the truth. The sheriff recalls the events of that Christmas evening. At the bar, the sheriff warned Elena to be cautious, as the drunken men would likely start fights. She assured him she wasn't worried. Later in her bar, a heavily intoxicated Pettigrew showed Yuri a map claiming it marked the location of a great treasure. Yuri dismissed it as nonsense. Frustrated, Pettigrew picked a fight with Eric. The officer knocked him out, and Pettigrew returned to the bar after everyone had left. He asked Elena to bring ice to his room, and though reluctant, she complied. Inside the room, Pettigrew handcuffed Elena to the bed, but she managed to grab a knife from the nightstand and stab him in the back. She then called the sheriff for help. The sheriff arrived at the hotel but found Pettigrew alive and recovering enough to potentially assault Elena. Enraged, the sheriff forced Pettigrew into his car. As he drove, Pettigrew taunted him, accusing him of desiring Elena in the same way. Furious, the sheriff drove Pettigrew to the ocean's edge and handcuffed him to a metal tower. Before long, a polar bear attacked and mauled Pettigrew. Henry witnessed the scene and shot the bear in the head. Morton urges the sheriff to confess for his own peace of mind. Morton then succumbs to his injuries and dies. The sheriff bids Henry farewell and returns to Fortitude, where he confesses everything to Hilda. She warns that this will bring a flood of London police to the town. Meanwhile, Cordero and Yuri break into a garage and steal the drill. Back in the lab, Jason attacks Natalie, screaming that he allowed AT inside him. He smashes glass containers and flees. Natalie later tells Vincent and the police about the incident. At the same time, news of the stolen drill arrives. Eric suspects Jason might be responsible. Vincent suggests examining the professor's dog, which was shot at the crime scene, while Petra performs Morton's autopsy. Eric tracks the stolen drill, which stops at a location Yuri had specified and begins operating. Meanwhile, Carrie and Elena visit the Sutters' home because Carrie wants to see Liam. Despite the tension, Jules invites them in. Carrie talks to Liam about her missing father, but Liam remains silent. Jules shares her concerns with Elena about Liam's obsession with the charm Henry gave him, noting that he screams whenever she tries to take it away. Vincent brings the professor's dog to the lab and begins an autopsy. At the hospital, the comatose doctor's face begins to swell with visible pustules. The sheriff confesses to Elena that he killed Pettigrew and also confesses his love for her. The dog's autopsy reveals it had swallowed larvae similar to those found in Pettigrew's remains, likely the same kind now inside the doctor. Scientists rush to the hospital where they discover the doctor's body covered in sores, from which parasitic wasps begin to hatch. As Vincent struggles to comprehend the scene, a swarm bursts from her mouth, filling the ICU. Vincent orders Natalie to keep the doors shut and fetch the sheriff, while he remains inside. The sheriff arrives and declares they must destroy the parasites, even though Vincent is trapped. Vincent suggests using gas. Natalie and the sheriff bring in a tank of hydrogen-oxygen mix, filling the room. Vincent uses a lighter to ignite the gas, causing a massive explosion. Miraculously, he survives, though severely burned. Meanwhile, Yuri and Cordero drill through the glacier and celebrate their imminent discovery. In town, Natalie explains to Hilda that the parasitic wasps need a host to grow into adult insects. The species is prehistoric, likely preserved in the permafrost, protected by something. Hilda recalls the mammoth tooth. The sheriff realizes they need to find Jason immediately. On the glacier, Yuri begins drilling deeper. As they prepare to descend into the hole, Eric arrives at the scene. Yuri pulls a gun, while Max steals Eric's snowmobile. Escapes. Yuri challenges Eric to a one-on-one fight. The men fight fiercely, and as Eric pauses to catch his breath after a hard blow, Yuri explains that Pettigrew found a treasure in the ice. He offers to share it with Eric. When Eric refuses, Yuri knocks him unconscious and begins his descent into the shaft. However, the cable snaps, and Yuri falls into the chasm. Meanwhile, Jason is found and arrested in town. Upon learning what's happening, he finally reveals the location of the mammoth carcass. Natalie shows the parasitic wasps to Marcus, who now understands how Shirley and her mother died. They both worry about whether larvae might also be inside Vincent. Eric regains consciousness. Unable to find Yuri, he commandeers the drill rig and heads back to town. Meanwhile, Elena begins to show signs of fever, similar to Shirley's symptoms. Fearing what might happen, she handcuffs herself to the bed. Police locate the warehouse containing the mammoth carcass and burn it, hoping this will end the nightmare. Later, Eric brings the drill rig back to town. Carrie returns home and finds Elena in a feverish state. Seeing her struggling, Carrie removes the handcuffs. However, the delirious Elena knocks her unconscious. The sheriff learns of Jason's death. Before dying, Jason revealed Ronnie's location. The sheriff rushes to Carrie's house, where Elena, now fully overtaken by the unknown force, grabs a knife and prepares to harm the girl. The sheriff bursts through the door and, unsure of how to stop whatever has taken hold of Elena, shoots her despite his deep feelings for her. He calls for an ambulance and carries the injured Carrie to safety. Meanwhile, Madeline visits Vincent and reassures him that the wasps mature within 48 hours, so he might only be wounded and not infected. She promises to stay by his side and tells him she is proud of him. Deep beneath the ice, Yuri wakes up in a massive cavern filled with thawing mammoth carcasses and swarms of buzzing wasps. As night falls, the sheriff reflects on his memories of Elena while she lies in critical condition in the ICU. The show blends multiple genres seamlessly. Initially, it begins as a tense detective thriller, where uncovering the murderer in a conspiracy, possibly involving local authorities and international powers, is the central focus. Over time, the story veers into horror and mysticism. The number of terrifying scenes increases, pushing even the most resilient viewers to brace themselves for episodes that can deeply disturb their nerves.